Triangle congruence postulates. The two triangles are said to be congruent if their corresponding sides and angles are congruent. So in uh, these two given triangles, if these sides are congruent, these corresponding sides are also congruent or have the same measure. These blue sides or these two corresponding sides are also congruent. Then this angle is congruent to its corresponding angle. This angle is also congruent to its corresponding angle. And this third angle is congruent or have the same measure with its corresponding angle. If these six parts are congruent with each other, we can say that these two triangles are congruent. So all the six parts, all the six corresponding parts must be congruent. But this is how the triangle congruence postulates will come into play, wherein we don't need to identify all the six parts of this triangle. So one of the postulates is the Sss postulate. Sss means side angle sides, wherein we need to identify only the three corresponding sides of that triangles. Then we can conclude that triangles are congruent by Sss postulate. For example, if these two sides are congruent, the other two angles are congruent, and the other two sides are congruent or corresponding sides. If they're all congruent with each other, by Sss postulate, we can conclude that these two triangles are congruent with each other because the remaining corresponding sides are also congruent. So it is so easy for us to identify the corresponding parts if the two triangles are in the same orientation. So let us give an example of two triangles with a different orientation. So let's say these two sides are congruent, these two angles are congruent, and the other two sides are congruent. So this information is enough for us to conclude that these two triangles or the triangles that will be created are congruent with each other by this side angle side postulate, okay, using this Sss postulate. So it follows that the remaining corresponding parts are also congruent with each other. The angles, this angle with this angle, this side with this angle, those remaining parts are also congruent with each other by Sss postulate. Second is the Assa postulate. It means angle, side, angle. If this angle are if these angles are congruent, these two sides are congruent, and the other two angles are also congruent. So this information is enough to say that the triangles that will be created are congruent with each other because the remaining corresponding parts are also congruent. So since these two triangles are congruent, all the parts are also congruent by Assa postulate. So another example, so if these two angles are congruent, and the other two sides are congruent, the other two corresponding angles are congruent, so we can say that these two triangles are congruent by angle side angle postulate, no matter how it is uh, how the triangle is oriented, as long as we can identify the corresponding parts of that particular triangle. Lastly, the SSS postulate, or the side, side, side. So it means if these two corresponding sides are congruent, the other corresponding sides are also congruent, the third sides are also congruent, we can say that the remaining parts, the angles or the corresponding angles are also congruent, and that makes these two triangles congruent with each other, and that is by SSS postulate. Another example, if these two sides are congruent, the other corresponding sides are congruent, the third corresponding sides are congruent, it follows that the remaining corresponding angles are also congruent. So corresponding angles, so this one correspond to this angle. So they must have the same measure also. And this angle must be congruent to its corresponding angle. This angle must also be congruent to its corresponding angle. So these two triangles are congruent to each other by SSS postulate or by side, side, side postulates.